Seven Initiations was the first book I wrote. And basically I was approached by a publisher, which was the Edgar Cayce Foundation. And even before I wrote the book, they had talked to me, some of the folks from the ARE, and asked me if I was interested in publishing a book with them. And so I sort of started the Seven Initiations material a long time ago. Essentially, you could say I started writing the book 20, 30 years ago because it was the premise of some of my original teachings. So the Seven Initiations on the Spiritual Path, which is subtitled Understanding the Purpose to Life's Tests, was part of my original teachings, and it's sort of maintained ever since. And in publishing the book, the idea was sort of to get across some of my primary teachings and the sort of the foundation of what I teach, but also it was utilizing so many different pieces of teachings in the world. So Seven Initiations on the Spiritual Path brings together the concept of chakras, the concept of sacred geometry, ancient civilizations, and so on. Essentially, the book starts along these lines, that in all of us there are seven major chakras through the body. And instead of the usual conversation about chakras, imagine the chakras to be almost like a destinations or identifications of who you are and where you're going to or where you're growing to. So I use the Seven Initiations as follows. The upper three chakras represent our divinity. The lower three chakras sort of represent more like our humanness, and that would be like the upper three chakras are collectively like the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, or the Hindu Trinity, and so on. But the lower three chakras represent our humanness. So that leaves one chakra in between the two as our chooser. It's the heart center. And so this concept of the Seven Initiations on the Spiritual Path is essentially to say this. Ultimately, what is the purpose to life's tests? There is no purpose, because in one respect it's all an illusion. We're all still tucked away in heaven in our divinity, dreaming of this world. However, since we believe we're here, we have something to deal with, and that is we believe we've left our divinity, so therefore we're on a path of evolution. And that path can be found using the body as a metaphor and the chakras as places of identification. So the root chakra represents the soul's attempt to understand itself now that it thinks it's physical. The emotional center is the soul's attempt to understand itself now that it thinks it's emotional. And the intellectual center and the heart center and so forth. So the upper three chakras represent our divinity that's still intact. But the rest of us, the four centers of the body, represent our humanness. And so the soul is trying to understand itself. I once was one with God, but I feel like I've separated from that divinity. And now we're basically growing through these other chakras. What people often don't understand is they assume growing through the chakras on our way to our divinity means, kind of like in the carnival old game where you use the hammer and you hit the bell and the little weight goes up and hits the bell, and that means you've reached enlightenment in our metaphor here. Well, it's not like that at all. Our growth is going to be determined by whether or not our centers are all glowing and growing and reached a state of balanced enlightenment. In other words, all aspects of our being should be present and fully aflame. So the chakras are more, instead of growing upward towards a place of enlightenment, as often is erroneously assumed, it's more, how do I awaken these in a balanced sense? And we take the divine, we bring it into the heart, and we learn to anchor that down into the body. So said in summary, the Seven Initiations on the Spiritual Path is trying to explain basically that we're all not going to heaven, we're growing to heaven. So we use the chakras as a metaphor of what parts of us are reaching that place and which parts are not. If there are centers in our body, and the centers again symbolize first our physical nature, our emotional nature, our intellectual nature, our intuitive nature, and collectively these upper three, our divine nature. So the chakras are depicting for us the spiritual centers of the body, each representing spiritual centers, tell us where we're on and where we're not on. Which centers are saying to us, this part needs some work. So we find in the book really vividly, and I use all kinds of parables and parallels and modern day stories, whether it's the Wizard of Oz or the never-ending story. It's basically explaining that we're on this spiritual journey, we're learning about ourselves, that the soul is the intelligence behind this process. The soul is the intelligence saying, I'm noticing that this one part of yourself is not quite reaching a balanced, healthy state, so I'm going to put you through particular tests, lessons in life. So that's the purpose of life's test. The apparent reason for life's test is to help us fine-tune any particular center in our being. And so ultimately, it's our soul recognizes that ultimately we're divine, but we don't feel quite divine. So it puts us through particular tests to fine-tune these different states of consciousness that we believe ourselves to be. The 7 initiations on the spiritual path make sense to a lot of people because I bring together a lot of different systems, from sacred geometry, ancient civilizations, and so on, to explain. Ancient civilizations used to put their people through many initiations. Those who were on the spiritual path, dedicated, they would go through initiations to basically demonstrate awakening. Well, these days we don't find ourselves in quite those kinds of schools with quite that intense level of commitment, but we do find ourselves going through stuff every day. We're just life initiations. And I'm explaining in the book why we go through the things we go through. And I also introduce, at the end of every chapter, ideas on how to work on the area that you feel you're a little weak, how to work on the physical chakra or the emotional chakra and so forth. If you don't get on board and work with it, the soul is going to find a way to get you to work on it, which is usually not going to be the easy way. It'll be the hard way. One of the primary things we teach in the book, The 7 Initiations on the Spiritual Path, is how to learn the easy way instead of the hard way. And one last thing, shared in the book, you'll find not only a checklist of books and concepts and things you might do to fine-tune your particular levels of consciousness, but it also helps us understand that everybody's been on the same path, whether we call it paganism, Catholicism, whatever the particular path. There's no path one better than another. It's really that all the paths are the same. You're just really working from one particular center or another. So you'll probably enjoy this book. Most people find that it's really far-reaching. It really taps into a lot of different studies, teachings, and a lot of folks find that it really brings a lot of things together.